A woman left her daughter with a friend for one evening, but when she returned home, she walked into a scene that resembled more of a horror movie than reality. Something terrible had happened in her absence, and the police began their investigation. They found several clues and eerie messages left by the perpetrator, but this mystery remained unsolved for decades. It wasn't until 26 years later, due to an unexpected turn of events, that the case was finally solved. Robin Cornell was born on November 30, 1978, in Florida. She had an older sister and a loving mother, Jen, who raised the girls on her own since their father was not actively involved in their lives. When Robin was 10, they moved to a town called Cape Coral. Jan got a job at a local hospital and found a home just a few minutes' walk from work. Her older daughter had gone off to study and moved out, so it was just Jan and her younger daughter living together. Robin really liked this town. She made friends right away at her new school, joined a few sports teams, and quickly settled into her new environment. In her free time, Robin loved exploring nature with her friends, but most of all, she loved animals. Once, she found an injured bird, took it home, and nursed it back to health until it could fly again. Jan was also happy with the move. She had found a good job and met a man named Donald, and they started dating. Since the birth of her daughters, Jan had devoted all her time to caring for them and working, so she was glad to finally have a chance to build her own personal life. At the hospital, Jan also met a woman named Lisa, and over time, they became best friends. In early May 1990, Jan suggested Lisa move in with them as it was difficult for Lisa to afford renting a place on her own. Jan was also happy to share the rent, and they had plenty of space. Their complex consisted of 2-story townhouses, and there was a spare room for Lisa. Eventually, Lisa moved in. She immediately got along with Robin, who was 11 at the time, and even agreed to babysit her when Jan was at work. On the evening of May 9th, a week after Lisa moved in with them, Jan planned to visit Donald to watch a game together. At first, she thought about canceling these plans because she felt uneasy asking Lisa to watch Robin for the entire evening. But Lisa reassured her that it was no trouble at all and she would be happy to spend time with her. So, Jan went to Donald's house, leaving Robin with Lisa. She planned to return in a few hours as she had to work an early shift at the hospital the next morning. However, she accidentally fell asleep while watching TV. Jan woke up around 3 a.m., got ready, and drove back home. When she approached her front door, she was surprised to find it locked on both locks. This was strange, because she had told Lisa that she only had the key to the top lock. As she tried to unlock the door, Jan heard footsteps inside and thought her friend was coming to let her in. But the footsteps quickly faded, so she knocked on the door several times. When no one answered, Jan decided to go around the back of the house to try entering through the sliding door. When Jan reached the back, she saw the sliding door was slightly open. Given that it was 4 a.m., the house was dark, and no one responded to her knocks, she became seriously worried. She tried to calm herself, thinking that Lisa might have forgotten to close the door when letting out her cats. But when Jan entered the house and walked into the kitchen, her worry only grew. Family photos of Robin and her older daughter were neatly arranged on an ironing board. These photos always hung on the living room wall, so Jan was baffled. She couldn't think of any reason why Lisa or Robin would take them down and place them like that. Moreover, the house was in disarray. Many items were scattered and broken, suggesting that something terrible had happened. Jan went upstairs to her daughter's room and was met with a heartbreaking sight. Robin was laying face down on the floor beside her bed, covered in bruises, with some of her clothing pulled down. Jan rushed to her daughter and immediately realized she was dead because her body was cold. Despite this, Jan was in shock and couldn't accept what was happening. She called an ambulance and tried to save Robin, even though deep down, she knew it was too late. As the ambulance was on its way, several neighbors were awakened by Jan's loud cries. She was overwhelmed with grief, calling for help and trying to get the attention of other complex residents. The police were first to arrive at the scene. They went upstairs to Robin's room and confirmed that she was dead. But that wasn't all. In another room, officers found the body of 32-year-old Lisa on the bed. She also had visible bruises, and both bodies were handed over to medical examiners for further examination. Detectives began their investigation and quickly found the first clues. There were several cigarette butts in the house that didn't belong to either Lisa or January. On the nightstand in Jan's bedroom, police found a set of car keys for a Toyota, which could fit a wide range of models from the 1980s. It seemed the perpetrator had either accidentally left them at the scene or did so intentionally for some reason. Detectives also concluded that the perpetrator had taken a shower after the murders to wash off the blood, as it was still wet. The killer had also left his socks in the bedroom, but the police couldn't figure out why. With Jan's help, they discovered that several items were missing from the house. Lisa's driver's license, her credit cards, a checkbook, and a watch she had planned to give to her boyfriend. Notably, the watch had an engraved message from Lisa to her boyfriend, expressing her love. The selection of stolen items seemed strange to the police. The watch wasn't particularly valuable and wouldn't fetch much if resold, and the personal engraving would make it traceable. It would also be easy to track ATM withdrawals made with the stolen credit cards. So, detectives weren't quite sure why someone who committed a double murder would take these items. Regarding the photos of Robin laid out on the ironing board, detectives speculated that the perpetrator might have left this as a message either for Jan or the police. Local investigators immediately requested help from the state police, as their resources were clearly not enough for such a complex case. Forensic experts arrived at the scene and began examining the house using modern tools to find any clues. First, they determined that the perpetrator had entered the house through a bedroom window on the first floor by cutting part of the protective screen. Next, they examined Robin's bed and found some biological material on the sheets, which was sent to the lab for analysis. Although DNA testing was already in use at the time, the detectives had to wait quite a while for the results. Meanwhile, medical examiners studied the victims' bodies and determined that the cause of death for both Lisa and Robin was asphyxiation. According to the expert, the perpetrator inflicted multiple blows on them and then killed his victims using pillows. They also established that both victims had been assaulted and extracted the perpetrator's biological material from Robin's body, which was immediately sent to the lab. Experts concluded that the perpetrator had likely committed the assault after the murders. A male hair was also found on Lisa's body and was sent for analysis. While waiting for the DNA test results, the police began searching for possible suspects. They quickly got their first serious lead. Jan mentioned that for the past 3 nights, she had been woken up by strange noises. She would wake up to the sound of the gate in her yard creaking and even thought someone was opening the sliding back door. However, it was dark outside and she couldn't see if anyone was near her house. On the morning of May 9th, when it was already light out, she woke up and saw a man standing outside her window. He smiled and then disappeared from view. Jan was frightened but decided not to call the police. She didn't get a good look at the man's face and thought he might be someone from the complex as the townhouses were connected to each other. Detectives immediately began checking Jan's neighbors, not only in their complex, but also in the nearby area. They investigated all the men, their alibis on the night of the murders, and requested DNA samples. Through this process, they identified 19 individuals who could have possibly committed the crime. Later, this list was narrowed down to 10 names, but the police couldn't confirm the involvement of any of them. When experts extracted DNA samples from the semen found on Robin's body, as well as from the sheet on her bed and pillow, they determined that all 3 samples belonged to the same man. However, there was no match in the FBI database, and the samples did not match those provided by some of the neighbors. Not all neighbors agreed to voluntarily provide their genetic material, and soon the detectives began focusing on one of these individuals. After interviewing other neighbors, they learned that this man had been repeatedly seen peeping into windows, though he had never been formally charged. Their suspicions grew when this individual suddenly moved to another state shortly after the murders. The police investigated his potential involvement and even traveled to Missouri to speak with him, but they couldn't link him to the case. When they showed Jan a photo of this man, she said he did resemble the person she saw outside her window, but his connection to the murders remained unclear. One of the residents also reported seeing an unfamiliar car at the complex territory the day before the murders. She said the car was slowly driving between the houses and a man in a red cap was behind the wheel, but the police were unable to track him down. Detectives also attempted to check all owners of Toyota cars that matched the models for the keys found in Jan's room, but this investigation did not yield any results either. Given that the perpetrator took many of Lisa's personal items, including the watch she intended to give her boyfriend, investigators considered the possibility that the murders were committed by someone who knew her well and had personal motives. They investigated her boyfriend and tried to find any ex-partners, but no evidence linked any of them to the crime. As a result, the case stalled for months. The police continued working on it, examining new suspects and comparing their DNA with the perpetrator's sample, but each lead turned into a dead end. Jan repeatedly appealed to the public, asking for any information that might help the police identify the killer. She was also puzzled by the fact that none of her neighbors heard anything that night, even though investigators believe the murderer must have made a lot of noise. The murders of Robin and Lisa were covered on national television, which brought in hundreds of tips, but none of them led to a breakthrough. About a year after the murders, the police identified a new suspect. A 27-year-old man living in the same area confessed to killing 3 different people within a few years. He also stated that if he wasn't put in jail for the rest of his life, he would kill again. Detectives working on Lisa and Robin's case investigated him, but he was found to be unrelated to their murders. Since then, there had been no progress in the case for many years. Jan occasionally gave interviews to local media, expressing hope that one day the killer would be brought to justice. The police also stated that they had not abandoned the investigation, but they simply had no new leads. In 2005, 15 years after the murders, the case was reopened. This time, the police department allocated funding for one detective to work exclusively on the case for 6 months. However, despite all the hard work, the detective was unable to get any closer to finding the perpetrator. In the following years, there were no breakthroughs in the case, but in August 2016, everything unexpectedly changed. Police from a neighboring town, located just about 6 miles from Jan's complex, arrested a 54-year-old man who had attacked his adult son with an air rifle. Although the son wasn't seriously injured, a law required the suspect to provide a DNA sample for their database. Once his DNA profile was in the system, detectives working on Lisa and Robin's case received the long-awaited match. The man's DNA was a perfect match with the 3 semen samples from the crime scene. The man's name was Joseph Ziller. Investigators immediately requested a direct DNA sample from him so experts could compare it directly with the 3 semen samples, which were still stored in the evidence warehouse. Since he was already in custody, his permission wasn't required, and the sample was quickly sent to the lab. After conducting the analysis, they confirmed a complete match, establishing that the semen from Robin's body and bed belonged to him. Joseph, who was 28 at the time of the murders, had a lengthy criminal record, mostly consisting of minor offenses. Police discovered that just 2 months after Lisa and Robin's deaths, he was arrested for selling stolen items and carrying an illegal firearm. He was sentenced to a short prison term, but at that time, the law did not require DNA samples to be taken from individuals convicted of those kind of offenses. Joseph had never been a suspect in the case and had not even been mentioned in the case materials. At the time of the murders, he lived in a neighboring town and detectives were simply unaware of his existence. Shortly after receiving a match, Joseph was arrested and the prosecution announced their intention to seek the death penalty. Joseph denied his guilt, so he was placed in jail awaiting trial. Given that his life was on the line, the preparation for the trial took several years. It began on May 8, 2023, almost exactly 33 years after the murders. With multiple DNA samples tying him to the crime scene and the body of one of the victims, Joseph had little chance of avoiding punishment, and the trial was expected to proceed without any difficulties. However, no one expected how Joseph would behave. His actions and statements in court drew the attention of millions across the country. The prosecution presented its evidence primarily based on the 3 DNA samples. The prosecutor argued that the death penalty was fully justified in this case. According to him, Joseph's actions were deliberate and he had plenty of time to change his mind. Instead, he methodically killed 2 victims, assaulted them, took some items from the house, laid out Robin's photos on the ironing board, and even took a shower. Joseph showed no signs of remorse. Since his arrest, he had nearly 7 years to confess and alleviate the suffering of the victims' families, who had been waiting for the trial to begin, but Joseph continued to maintain his innocence. When it was the turn of Joseph's lawyer to speak, he understandably could not present any significant evidence proving his client's innocence or contest the match of the 3 DNA samples. Instead, he argued that Joseph simply had no motive, suggesting that someone else committed the crime. The lawyer also claimed that based on the existing evidence, the killer must have known Jan and was trying to harm her. When Joseph took the stand, he put on quite a show. He repeatedly screamed at the jurors, the prosecutor, and even his own lawyers, hurling insults and flipping them off. When asked how his DNA ended up on Robin's bedsheet and pillow, he suddenly claimed that he had slept with her mother a few months before the incident. He added that he wasn't responsible for her not washing her bedding for months and called her a pig. Jan, who had to listen to all of this, stated that she had never seen this man before his arrest and certainly never brought him into her home. The prosecution called an expert who explained that the semen traces were clearly fresh, with documented evidence to support this claim. If they had indeed been on the fabric for several months, it would have been obvious during the initial examination. Moreover, one of the samples was found in Robin's body, which completely contradicted the defendant's version. In response, Joseph hurled more insults at Jan, ignoring his lawyer's pleas to behave properly. They tried to explain that his behavior was only helping the prosecution's case, but he refused to listen. Ultimately, it took the jury only 5 hours to deliver their verdict. They found Joseph guilty of the murders, leaving the court to decide his punishment. Joseph's behavior during the sentencing phase was also quite surprising. But more on that later. After the guilty verdict, Joseph's lawyers tried to convince the court to drop the death penalty. They pointed out that Joseph had a difficult childhood with a very strict father. They also argued that Joseph suffered from mental disorders and should not be sentenced to such a severe punishment. Additionally, the defense claimed that Joseph had lost his memory in 1998 due to a motorcycle accident. However, experts who had assessed Joseph's condition over an extended period found no evidence to support these claims. In their opinion, Joseph was fully aware of his actions, capable of planning them in advance, and eligible for the death penalty. In late June 2023, Joseph was brought into the courtroom for sentencing. As he walked to his seat, he beckoned his lawyer over and leaned in to say something, but, instead, unexpectedly elbowed his own defense attorney in the head, leading security to restrain him. Despite this dramatic turn, the lawyer chose not to press charges and continued to defend Joseph, although he couldn't protect him from the death penalty which the judge imposed. Joseph was subsequently taken to prison, where he remains to this day. Jan, along with Lisa's relatives, thanked everyone involved for bringing closure to the case. Despite Joseph never admitting guilt, his involvement in the murders left no doubt, and both victims' families finally achieved justice. It's worth mentioning that in February 2024, police arrested Joseph's 32-year-old son for possessing illegal materials involving minors, and now he is potentially facing prison time. He might even end up in the same prison where his father awaits execution.